Keith and Stella have an acknowledgement here because they have provided a refuge out of their place on the road for Lia on the many occasions that Lia has been here to progress this book. When she had to go somewhere and then would come back to Alice Springs, settle down again, write some more, have bad dreams, get confused, worried about what she was doing. Stella and Chris looked after you, didn't they?
Stella and Keith, they did indeed.
Yeah, Keith. I would like to introduce Lia's work. It's one of several works of hers. Some have been made available and some are in languages or some are about other countries, far countries, and she will talk more about the translation and other countries in the session down to 3 o'clock. We will leave this room at 1:31 to give time for those to join the next session at 1:45, so there's no cluster and grumbling about people arriving late, and those who would like to talk with Lia personally or have a book signing from 1:31, this room is still available. How was that, Danny? Was that all right? As I will tell you a little of the story in a minute, but I want to say a little bit more about the structure of the crying place and something about the structure of Lia's brain. Because she and her husband Patrick have spent a lot of time travelling North Africa, parts of Europe. They speak French. I think Patrick's French actually.
Swiss French.
Yeah, see, and he speaks French. And because of the listening to different languages, the North African languages when they were travelling there, the French, the English, some of the Australian indigenous languages, Lia has gradually developed the capacity to hear things in other sounds and other languages that not very many of us have been able to accomplish, though there are some people in this room who do have that capacity to cross, as it were, languages and sensibilities. In fact, I can see Lia quite a lot of people in this room who do that. Actually, so you are among, I hope, friends on this crossing the brain, left and right, and language and sound and so on. So this book is in some ways an attempt, maybe some of you think it's succeeded, maybe some of you think it needs more visits here, who knows, that's up to you. It is a novel and it's a fiction, but it's a demonstration of somebody trying to gather together some of the places in this country, from Tasmania, Melbourne, Sydney, Alice Springs, further south toward places that are in Pitjantjatjara land, back again, weaving, trying to pick up not so much a story, but a feeling of, what am I doing here? Why did the man who is the absent hero in this book travel to Alice and then out west? Why did he do the things he did? How come he passed away and what were the conditions of his death? How did he form a relationship with a Pitjantjatjara woman? What tore them apart? How did all this begin to develop? What happened to his friend who's pursuing him, travelling the country, trying to pick up the pieces of this mysterious death? Finally having some resolution, but not a lot, because how many of us really resolve the death of our close friends and family? And many of us in this room have that experience of the loss of young men. All of this is woven in with her description of the landscape and the travel and the road. So the basic story is this. Two young men who have spent a lot of time together on motorbikes, travelling in North Africa, come back to Australia, do a lot of bad things together, separate, go in different places, and then one day one of them hears the news that his friend has suddenly, unexpectedly passed away. He then sets out to try to find what happened to him. Where is he, in fact? Where is his spirit rested? And what were the consequences of that life when he went away and no one quite knew where he went or why? And I'm not going to give it all away, but it's that kind of road story, but somewhat different to the kind of macho road stories you see on TV, like Backroads. They're good, I mean, those road stories, but this is a little different. And I think with that introduction, and I probably missed some key part, I'd like to ask Lia to read you a page. Thank you.
It's always fascinating to hear someone else's take on the story. It's lovely, great, thank you. I'm going to read a little extract, because Craig says it's really nice for people to actually hear the book up front, so they might know what we're talking about. And I'm going to read a little extract from near the end of the novel. It doesn't have any spoilers, so don't worry about that. And so the narrator's name is Saul. It's written in the first person, the whole novel. So Saul is the man who goes in search of answers about his friend's death. And he's sitting on a bluff looking out over the Derwent River. He's from Hobart. Both the boys were from Hobart. And he's returned to the place of his birth. And he's reflecting on what has just occurred, of the journey that he's made. Sometimes I think of this whole thing as a ghost story, given like the gull that just stepped off the lip of rock into the water and is being spun by unseen force currents, big raised to the air. As I sit here at the bottom of an island below an island, the arse end of the arse end, as my father once said, it's so easy to draw on the grand traditions of Tasmanian Gothic. But this is a world of dripping rainforests and escaped convicts and silent blacks, other forms of exile. I had to leave the place of my birth in order to understand it. Go into the desert. First, a foreign one, because sometimes we need a distant reference point in order to bring things into focus. Then that great dry land which lies at the centre of this country and was once referred to as the Dead Heart, as if the fledgling nation was already fighting for its life. Many have felt a similar urge to go into the desert, sensed that the stories they heard and told along the way, the ones that take their breath from the winds which construct and dismantle the dunes, could shape them too. Lend a little of the amplitude afforded by so much space. But there's something bigger at stake, less personal, at least in this place. Thaddeus is a kind of a hermit character living in the community that Saul meets. Thaddeus hinted at it when he said we'd never found a myth to replace the one about the inland sea. What was left was a great empty void. Except it wasn't. The silence was a lie. So was the emptiness. All along it was inhabited by people who knew its waters, whose stories have always aligned with them. Through this story, some of the things that I notice is that there is a description of a section of the country or the road, and I think you do that really nicely. That's great.
And sometimes you get the mentality of men, and mostly it's men. And just in case you didn't know, Lia is a woman. And sometimes I think, how could she know that's how we think? So when you get to the bits where she writes, as it were, from the men's point of view, when you get to read it, ring her up and say, how come you could think like a man just there? So I mentioned that. We won't go into that today, but there's a couple of bits that you might be interested in knowing how the book was written when Patrick and Lia were driving, and much of it was recorded, like on a recording as she was travelling, so she was kind of telling it rather than writing it. And I think maybe tell the folk how you did that.
Thank you.
And Patrick can add it to
Yeah,
it.
Patrick's back there in the checkered shirt. He's sort of been dragged into this book over the 5-year process many times. So when I had the initial idea about writing the book, I felt that rather than writing it in the traditional sense, that I wanted to record it in order, for a number of reasons. We were going to be writing it on the road, which includes places like the Unwin track, and like typing on a laptop's not that easy when you're going over the corrugation. So for logistical reasons, but there was sort of a much more sort of creative reason behind it, and that was I wanted to get closer to traditional forms of storytelling as Saul moved more towards the centre. So I felt that telling the story rather than writing it would change the rhythms of it. I'm also a poet and very, very aware of rhythms in my work. So I decided to use a really sophisticated soft voice recognition software, which is kind of ironic when you're trying to get back to a very traditional form of storytelling. So I set that up on my laptop and I trained it up because it has to get to learn your voice to be accurate. Some of you may have used these softwares. I'm not going to do the advertising pitch and tell you which one it was. And it's kind of creepy because it goes through everything on your laptop, it goes through your emails, it really learns you. So that was sort of fantastic. Being a poet, sometimes if I wasn't sure what I said, it would, it has to put something logical, so it would err on the side of the lyrical, and it would actually put down something I didn't say, which was a hell of a lot better than what I did say. So I was sort of thinking, is this plagiarism? Plagiarizing your own poetic self. Anyway, it was really helpful, particularly on the Unwin track when its accuracy dropped down to about 70%. So a whole lot of it was not what I wrote. So the other really amazing and unpredictable aspect of this is it makes sense of any noise that it hears. So it hears your voice. I use a directional mic to try and keep it quite clean. But if it picks up birds, it translates the song into English language, okay? Because it has to make sense of sound. And it does the same with wind coming through the trees. So if the wind was coming through desert oak, through the needles, it would come up with on my screen. And first I was like, what was that? I didn't say that. And then I gradually started to work out that it was actually the wind being translated into language. And then if it went through the mulga, it would come up will. So I started to have a real sense of where the wind was travelling by looking at the trees around me and seeing what was coming up on the screen. So it was making me, in a way, listen in a more traditional sense to country, by using a really high-tech software. It was kind of this bizarre irony. And the strangest case of this, I was actually staying at Wallace Rock Hall at the time, and I was writing recording a scene where Saul's car breaks down just before he's going into a community. And he's sitting there and he's going, what the hell am I going to do now? He's alone, he's not properly equipped, he's about 20 k's from the community, night's falling. What am I going to do now? And I look on my screen and it says, push, push. What? I didn't say that. Okay, push the car, good idea, I'm alone, that's not going to work. And it was a bowerbird that had been watching me all morning as I was recording. The great imitators, I don't know if it was trying to imitate my voice, what it was doing, but just at that very moment, it had made a sound that had been translated into push, push on the screen. So if you read the book, that scene's in there. He's having a discussion with a bowerbird when the car breaks down and it says push, push, and he goes, what would you know about mechanics, So I decided right from the beginning to honour that process, that it completely changed the way that I listened to the country, and to its creatures, and understood that I was never alone, and that he was never alone when he was out in the landscape.
That was good.
Thanks, Grace.
Yeah.
Give me this nice running commentary on my...
Okay,
How are we going for
this is
time? I might have to ask
conversation
them
time,
questions.
Yeah.
They didn't ask me
Not
questions.
exactly questions, but something for Lia to carry on from.
Can I ask a follow-on question from that?
Yeah.
Have you done an audio version, and if so, have you used some of the original stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. There has been an audio made, so Audible bought the rights to that, and it was made by Mark Cole-Smith, who's an Indigenous actor from Broome. So the voice actually has that, intonation to it. So Saul is a white fella, but there's been this kind of interesting, almost like reverse colonisation of the story, which I really love, and it has these beautiful rhythms. He does the voices super well, particularly out in the community, which was a challenge for him because he's from Broome, and there's Pinjarra language in the book, so he had to contact people here. I don't know if you contacted anybody in this room. Really? It was Mark contacted you?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Because I got this hurried sort of series of emails from my publishers saying, and from Audible saying, we need to record this, and can you do, the Pinjarra language? I said, well, I can record it, but you need to speak to someone who really knows what they're talking about. So Mark got hold of you. So
But they didn't use me, he went somewhere else.
oh, did he? Okay. All right, I won't get into the politics today.
Okay, I understand how it works.
Okay, yeah. So I'm yet to
Glad he
speak to him
called
about
me, though.
that process. Yeah, it's good. And to do with the recordings, most of the recordings have got lost in the computer. I haven't worked out how to retrieve them. But some of the process recordings I did where I was, for example, walking in the dark in areas I shouldn't have been and getting kind of nervous. I had a little tape recorder. I was also recording some of that. And if anybody wants to hear that, Michael Cathcart did an interview with me on Radio National. And some of those recordings, and you can kind of hear me breathing and being kind of nervous and talking about the dogs following and those sorts of things. So that kind of captures that more sort of the writer's process of what I went through trying to record this book in various places. You probably had a question, Danny.
I did feel like I had a question. I wasn't sure what to say it out loud. It just struck me then as, did you ever think, 'cause, it's a novel.
Yes.
It's a fiction. And did you ever, when you're speaking though, you're very much talking about your own experience of writing. And did you ever think, I'll just write this as my own experience of what I'm doing here, as opposed to writing a fiction?
No. It always needed to be. I think it's often to the non-fiction writers in the room. I'm sorry, but I often feel there's a greater truth in fiction that you can get closer. And this voice, Saul's voice was very strong in me, and the story had a deep motivation from something that happened in my life that I was working through in the novel, and that was so I'm from New Zealand originally. I grew up surrounded by Maori language, Maori culture, Maori story. It's very much part of my understanding of the world and the country that I was living in. And at the age of 15, my parents moved to Tasmania. This is in the very early 80s. And I was very quickly aware of an absence when I got there, particularly given the politics of the time. And I said to people, where are the Aboriginal people? And sometimes people say, oh, they've left. Beautiful euphemism. But some people said things to me like, oh, it's all right, we got rid of them all. Yeah. So I felt that like a physical grief for a very long time, and I didn't know what to do with that story. And it didn't feel like a story I wanted to tell as a memoir story. Maybe it's because I'm a poet and a novelist primarily. It came out in the story of these two Tasmanian boys on this journey. And over the 5-year process of writing it, it's been a really healing process for me and dealing with that grief that I experienced in Tasmania, and speaking to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, and they did some recordings with some of the language that was used in the book. It's been a whole sort of healing process involved in that novel, but it always felt like it had to come through this novelistic process, and also because you can reach a different readership. Like, people are going to often pick up a non-fiction book because they're kind of convinced about that thing already or engaged with that. Whereas this novel, I've been retracing the steps as I came up here. We're retracing the original journey to come here for the festival, and we've been doing some events along the way. And I did one in Port Pirie, who don't do a lot of author talks out there. And I had a 92-year-old farmer come along, who'd never been to anything like that, but he'd been really interested in the book, and he'd seen the cover, and he loves the desert. And we had this fascinating conversation about his experience, and he may not have come to this kind of story if it hadn't been in a novel. So I had a bit of an agenda, I have to say, with the story, and I felt that I could reach a far broader readership and be preaching not just to the converted. Yeah, and I think that's often what we want to do, we want to take it that little step further. And that's why we went for this, it's a pretty commercial looking cover and gets people to pick it up, and even people who maybe read outback fiction that gets put next to those, and I'm getting emails from people who've never read this kind of book before, and they're almost writing like activists in their email by the time they get to the end of it. So that's when I feel really good. It's nice to be accepted by your own crowd, but it's also really nice to reach out to those other individuals. How are we going for time, Craig?
You're doing quite well. Time?
I've got 4 more minutes.
Time has not stopped.
Sanfin, you have a question for me? Yeah?
Just to follow on from that, given that it is, and for most fiction writers, probably there's a lot of autobiography inside the fiction. You say that you tell a great truth inside a fiction. Can you speak a bit maybe about why you chose 2 boys or 2 young men? Why you chose the masculine, perhaps?
Yeah.
Yeah,
People are often surprised. I've written before in the male voice. Actually, it's my most comfortable position to write in. It's like the mask. You're completely free. It's bizarre. If you write as a male, people just assume it's not autobiographical. So, that's great. There are scenes in the book where Saul, the narrator, and Jed, his friend who has died, if you're writing a novel about grief, you need to kind of pace it, so it's not always tragic. So there's sort of these glory scenes when they're back in the desert and they're riding the bikes, and those stories are almost 100% autobiographical. Patrick and I travelled on motorbikes through the Sahara, and they were just that was an act of love to write those stories, that have been so important to us and been defining for our family. My boys have names from the Sahara Desert. So those are incredibly autobiographical elements, and so much of what went into the writing over a 5-year period, the book was totally shaped by encounters, by conversations with Keith and Stella on their veranda, with people I met in communities, Nuncrew that I spoke to. It's totally reshaped the story. I stayed completely open. I knew Saul was heading north, he was grieving, he was going to end up in some community, but that was totally shaped by encounters, and so in a very broad sense, this story feels very connected to this place, and I'm very thankful to the way people shared stories here and in the outlying areas around here. People were incredibly generous, and the book would never have been the same if I'd sat at home and written it in the Dandenongs, It just wouldn't have been possible. It was a story shaped by encounters. Do you have time for one more, do you think, Craig?
That was really nice, though, to re-emphasise that. You didn't sit in your room and imagine. You followed the place and what happened and the people you met. The man in Coopapedi, who you met again on the way back this time.
Yeah, that was really weird. I was in the pub in Coopapedi, in the Italian Writers Club, where there's a scene there, and one of the guys who'd been such an incredible character, I didn't really change him much in the book. I thought, I've never read the novel. And then he walked into the pub and I was sitting there last weekend. And that was really freaky. The language in that section is probably not for a mixed audience. So. But yeah, the encounters have been extraordinary and impossible to write. And look, even there were scenes missing when I went back, like the original draft. So I spent about 3.5 weeks writing recording that original draft. I wanted to capture the urgency of it and write it in real time. And I had like 55,000 words. For you writers out there, it's a lot of words, in 3 weeks, especially when you're travelling. But then I got home and realised there were real gaps in the story. So that meant that I had to keep coming back. But also some of them I did record. I'd go and sit. There's this place I live in the Dandenongs we can see right out over the ranges, and I would write them in my car because I was always like Saul. I had to be in the car and I had to be out in the landscape. And yes, I was sometimes having to imagine this landscape, but I always recorded them. Those initial drafts of every single scene, just so it had those rhythms. So, okay, we might have to leave it at that.
You've got another minute. Would anyone like
a really quick question?
Would anyone like just to wind up?
Quick question. Do you feel self-conscious talking to yourself?
No. Well, it was really weird because Patrick was in the car driving me. That was weird. I suddenly, for the first couple of hours, were really tricky getting it because I'm writing in character, like method writing, like method acting, And it seemed like a good idea at the time. And then when we took off, dropped the kids at my parents' place and went to drive up here, and I suddenly went, I actually have to do this now, and I've got to do it like right now because I'm right in the city. And so that was a bit freaky. But Patrick, he'd be driving along like this, and then a finger would go up, and I'd press the pause button, and he'd go, nah, bloke wouldn't be thinking about that right now. Live edit, yeah, tricky stuff. Yeah, you wouldn't be thinking what his mum's going to wear to the funeral. He's worrying about the bloody stones hitting the chassis, and so yeah, that he kept my male voice honest. Just lastly, a big thank you to this man who was an integral part of making this book work and for launching it here in the Northern Territory today. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory launch of this book, and anyone who would like to stay and buy a book or get it.